Hello, everyone. Professor Kurzluck here. So, something that we've seen a lot in the news lately, debated on Capitol Hill, debated in the media, is who actually has the authority to take the United States to war. Something that has become front and center, talked about a lot because of the U.S. intervention into Iran. So the U.S. Constitution divides military power, military authority between two branches of government. Congress, of course, has the power to declare war. We've been hearing this debate over, well, Congress didn't declare war. We've heard this discussion, well, that's Congress's role. Wow, the president serves as commander in chief of the armed forces. So, on paper, this system was designed to prevent any single individual from having complete control over the decisions about war. When we take American government like 100, we talk about the importance of federalism, the importance of diverse power structure in a democracy like the US. We know that the founders were deeply wary of concentrating any power, much less military authority, in the hands of one person. Having just fought a war against a monarchy, they believed that the decision to enter a major conflict, a war, should involve democratic deliberation through Congress. However, over time, the balance of power between Congress and the presidency has shifted. In the modern era, in our contemporary world, presidents have increasingly used military force abroad without a formal declaration of war. This growing pattern is what eventually led Congress to pass one of the most important laws governing American military power, the War Powers Resolution of 1973. Something we're encountering in the news a lot. These discussions, these debates over the War Powers Resolution. So, to understand why Congress passed this law and why it's still being discussed today, we should probably step back to the experience of the Vietnam War. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, the United States gradually expanded its military involvement around the world. In Vietnam itself, at its peak, more than 500,000 American troops were deployed. Yet, despite this scale of conflict and other conflicts of the era, the United States never formally declared war. Instead, the Johnson administration relied on the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which was a congressional measure passed in 1964 after alleged attacks on U.S. naval vessels. This resolution gave the president broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia. Over time, however, many members of Congress came to realize or came to believe that this authority had been interpreted far beyond the more broadly concentrated way that it was initially intended to be implemented as. So, as the war dragged on and public opposition grew, Congress began to question whether presidents had gained too much unilateral power over military decisions. These concerns became even more intense during the Nixon administration when it was revealed that the United States had conducted secret bombing campaigns in Cambodia without clearly informing Congress. So, for many legislators of the time, this episode symbolized a deeper problem. The president had effectively taken the country into major military operations without meaningful congressional approval. Again, moving away from what in their eyes the founders had set out as this checks and balances system. This idea that Congress has this role to play in military conflicts. So, as a result, in response, Congress attempted to restore what it believed was the original constitutional balance between the legislature and the executive branch. The result was the War Powers Resolution of 1973. So, if you're following the news today, you will hear discussions from the Trump administration, some Republicans saying, well, the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional. So at the time, President Richard Nixon strongly opposed the legislation and vetoed it, arguing that it was unconstitutional. It was unconstitutionally limiting the presidential authority as commander-in-chief. However, Congress overrode the veto, and the law officially went into effect in November 1973. So, what does the War Powers Resolution actually say? At its core, it tries to ensure that decisions about war involve both branches of government. The law states that the introduction of U.S. forces into hostilities should reflect the collective judgment of both Congress and, of course, the executive. That it shouldn't just be the executive, that Congress plays a role in these decisions as well. So, in other words, the president may act quickly in emergencies. It gives flexibility to the commander-in-chief, but long-term military conflicts should require congressional authorization. So thus, if the executive needs to act quickly, they can, but Congress plays a role if those hostilities are more than just a short period of time. So the law attempts to achieve this goal through several key requirements. First, the War Powers Resolution includes what is commonly called the 48-hour notification rule. If the president sends U.S. armed forces into hostilities or into situations where combat is likely, the president must notify Congress within 48 hours. So this is something that maybe you heard J.D. Vance talk about. Some people in the Trump administration will say we disagree with the War Powers Resolution. We say it's unconstitutional, but we're still following it, and we notified Congress of our actions. So this report that the executive must send to Congress must explain why the troops were deployed, what legal authority the president is relying on, and what the expected scope and duration of the operation might be. So the purpose of this requirement is transparency. Congress must be informed whenever American forces are placed into potentially dangerous military situations. The second major provision of the law is what many people refer to as the 60-day clock. Once U.S. forces enter hostilities, the president has 60 days to obtain authorization from Congress. If Congress does not approve the military action, either through a declaration of war or through specific legislation, the president is then required to terminate the use of force. This role was designed to prevent presidents from sustaining long-term military conflicts without congressional approval and congressional oversight, insight, and them playing their role in the approval process. The law also includes an additional 30-day withdrawal period, which allows time for the safe removal of U.S. forces after the 60-day limit expires. In practical terms, this means that the president could theoretically deploy troops roughly 90 days without formal congressional authorization. But after that point, the operation would have to end unless Congress approves it. So while the War Powers Resolution appears fairly clear on paper, if you pull up the Wikipedia page, it looks pretty clear. It lays out what the War Powers Resolution says. Its real world application has been much more complicated. Nearly every president since 1973 has questioned whether the law is constitutional. Many presidents have argued that the resolution interferes with the authority their authority as commander in chief, particularly when rapid military decisions may be required. So, as a result of this, presidents often comply with the reporting requirements. Like I said, we know the Trump administration did. But they rarely acknowledge that the War Powers Resolution legally restricts their authority over international affairs, military conflict. So instead, presidents typically submit reports to Congress stating that they are acting consistent with the War Powers Resolution rather than explicitly stating that they are bound by the War Powers Resolution. So in addition, modern military operations are frequently authorized through what are known as authorizations for the use of military force. So AUMFs, something you may have encountered. I know if you take me for foreign policy, we talk about AUMFs. These are laws that are passed by Congress that authorize the president to use military force in specific situations, again, without formally declaring war. So some of the most significant examples include 1991 AUMF for the Gulf War, the 2001 authorization passed after the September 11th attacks, and the 2002 authorization for the Iraq War. So these authorizations effectively satisfy the War Powers Resolution requirement for congressional approval, even though they stop short of being formal declarations of war. So more than 50 years have passed since the passage of the War Powers Resolution. However, it remains a central part of the debate over American military authority. Again, we are hearing and seeing these debates play out on our television screens today, where there's a debate: has the Trump administration are they following the full letter of the law with the War Powers Resolution? So this is a debate that we've seen during the Biden administration, during the Trump administration 1, during Obama's administration, and then again with Trump administration 2. So it's certainly not something that's going to go away, but it is symbolic and gives an insight into the struggle between congressional power and the executive branch power, and who really holds the power to go to war in the United States. Thank you.